Welcome back. Part two of the thing, comparative politics, April 5th or something like that. Okay, so the video explained the logic of Duverger's law probably more clearly than I ever could, but let me just give a shot at a recap here. You've got two mechanisms that constrain the number of parties that are seen as competitive, especially in first past the post electoral systems. The first of those mechanisms is the voting mechanism. It's just there can only be one party, and so there's only room for a second party. You can only divide the votes among the losers so many directions before people start to realize, and this is the psychological mechanism, that a third party vote is throwing their vote away. Okay, so examples then of Duverger's law, right? The United States elects one member to the House of Representatives per district. So Duverger's law would predict that the US will have two stable, viable national parties. Germany elects 4 members to the Bundestag per district, so Germany should have 5. 5, yes, not 5 plus 1. Well, I'm in the edit mode, so I guess I can do that. Ha! Germany will have 5 viable national parties, okay? We can test this pretty easily, right? We would expect first past the post systems to have 2 centrist parties. Why would the 2 parties be centrist, by the way? Right? Hotelling's principle, if you only have 2 parties and you're on sort of a 2-dimensional beach, they're going to stand back to back next to one another so that they can serve as many customers from as far down the beach as possible. So not only would we expect that the parties would have, that there would be 2 parties, but we would also expect that those parties would be relatively close together, located relatively close together on any sort of political spectrum. So let's test this. Let's take a look. Strom and his co-authors tapped into a survey of political liberalism and political conservatism in the platform of 100 parties that exist all over the world, and then they created for us some charts about where on the ideological spectrum the parties fall and the vote share of each individual party. Here are the Democrats and the Republicans, located roughly at 5.25 and 5.75 on a scale of liberalism to conservatism, right? The US is suffering from a brutal combination of Hotelling and Duverger. So, sadly, for those of you who are interested in voting Green or Communist or Libertarian or any other third party, there are 2 realities you need to deal with. The first is that organizing and having a successfully insurgent party is extremely difficult. And second, what's eventually going to happen if you do organize a party insurgency, if you do sponsor some sort of deep reorganization of American politics, is that rather than create a third party, you're going to push one of the other 2 out of business in the long term. And then the 2 parties that are left in response to Hotelling's principle are going to slide themselves right back here. You'll notice that most of the things that we talk about in this class are referred to as theory or problem or something else that seems kind of wishy-washy, whereas Duverger's observation is a law. This is because we have observed this happen in first past the post systems over and over and over and over again. A 3-party state in a first past the post system is simply not particularly stable, and what you end up with typically is a movement back to the center. Now, the example of Britain is interesting in this way. We caught Britain in 2005 at a moment of upheaval. The Labour Party was being challenged by the Liberal Democratic Party from the left, and the Liberal Democratic Party was gaining votes among cosmopolitan urban dwellers. So for a time, the Labour Party pulled left in order to maximize the vote share that it could receive in response to the Liberal Democratic Party's performance. Now, the Lib Dems didn't last very long, right? They got destroyed in the last election because they never managed to expand their base of support outside of these cosmopolitan urban strongholds. The Labour Party, on the other hand, recaptured those votes to the left and has moved steadily back rightward to meet the Conservative Party somewhere in the center. Japan has a mixed system. In the upper house, you only have 1 seat per district, but in the lower house, you have a number of seats. And so what we see is greater dispersion here. right? The minority parties are not particularly powerful. There's some evidence still of Hotelling's problem constraining the DPJ and the Liberal Democrats to the center, the relative center of the political spectrum. But we see much, much more dispersion here. Germany. Here we have a Bundestag that is fully proportional representation, and we see powerful parties spread across the entire chart. France has runoffs. They do first past the post, but if you vote for a party that ultimately doesn't win, you're allowed to revote. So this gets rid of the psychological mechanism of throwing your vote away. You can see the relative power of the two major parties is still evidence that the political mechanism is operating. It's very difficult for one of these parties to get a great deal of vote share, but you do have some amount of influence on these parties, which is probably pulling your conservative party and your left-leaning party to the left and to the right, respectively, pulling them away from the center to capture as many votes as possible. Now, if you follow French politics, of course, there's a recent upheaval happening there. Emmanuel Macron's En Marche party, relatively centrist, probably stuck here in the 5 realm. They look a little bit like the American Democrats. Exploded onto the scene, won the presidency, won, I think, a majority of the legislature. And so now we're going to have to see what happens. To what extent can they poach vote share from other parties that already exist? Okay, so now we have seen examples of how electoral rules might change policy outcomes, and also how electoral rules might change interest aggregator outcomes. We might think about interest aggregation as more than an independent variable that changes policy. It may also be a dependent variable that's responsive to electoral rules. Now let's take a look at rules on governance, separation of powers, how each member of a democratic unit uses its authority. So, 2 basic types here. First is a presidential system, which we have in the United States and in much of Latin America. Hallmarks of a presidential system: the executive, or the president in this case, is elected separately from the legislature. In classic presidentialist systems, the president or the executive vetoes or accepts legislation rather than authoring it. We have a separate legislature that writes the laws and sends them up to the president to sign. We have elections at regular periods. That is, we know when the next election is going to be, and the next election, and the next election, and the next election, on into infinity, as long as our republic survives in the United States. This is different, we shall see, than in parliamentary systems. Parties choose their candidates in primaries, and then they open vote for office. So we know which particular candidate we are voting for when we go pull the lever in the United States or in presidential systems, particularly with respect to the president. Then lastly, the only way to remove the executive is by impeachment, which usually requires some proof of a high crime and a legislative supermajority. Spoiler alert, foreshadowing, depending upon how deeply you think about it. Perhaps presidential systems are prone to coups. Removing the executive is institutionally difficult, and so maybe a president or someone who would like to be president can take over the country and say, I'm the president, try and impeach me. And that is substantially more difficult, perhaps, than doing the same thing to a prime minister. We'll discuss more later. Okay, parliamentary systems, such as the United Kingdom, Germany, and Japan. Here, the prime minister is selected by the legislator. The executive branch, is not chosen directly by the voters. You vote for your local member of parliament, knowing who your local member of parliament is likely to vote for as prime minister, and you sort of cross your fingers. It's possible that they will eventually vote in a prime minister from your party that is not to your liking. Second difference here is that the prime minister and the prime minister's cabinet write the legislation, and then Parliament debates it. Parliament doesn't make any amendments. They yay it, they nay it, they explain to the Prime Minister why they yayed it or nayed it, and then the PM and the Cabinet have another go at writing it. We see this dynamic happening right now in Great Britain, right? Theresa May's administration, her Cabinet, is in charge of writing a new Brexit bill, and they bring the Brexit bill down to Parliament, and Parliament continues to vote it down over and over, but Parliament has not yet, as of this recording, taken on any sort of responsibility for authoring a bill of their own or working closely with the Prime Minister to do it. They just keep telling her no. Elections happen at a time of the government's choosing. So there is some time limit. I think in Great Britain it's 5 years. I think in Japan it's 6. A government can only be in power for that long. But they can call an election at any time prior to that. And typically they call an election when they are feeling strong, obviously. When they have engaged in some major policy victory, they put themselves out there for a vote and certify their rule for another 5 or 6 year maximum. In parliamentary systems, voters choose legislators and then lawmakers choose a president. It really should say prime minister, or really even better than that, it should say an executive. Prime ministers are then removed by a vote of no confidence, which is a bare majority. So in most systems, most parliamentary systems, the legislature can take a bare majority vote to remove a prime minister from office when they think that the prime minister is no longer enacting policies that are in the interests of the party or its constituencies. The downside is that a vote of no confidence typically triggers a new election. So in the United Kingdom, the Tories, for example, cannot remove Theresa May by no confidence without triggering another election, which means that they may not get a prime minister they like more than Theresa May. They may end up with a Labour minister, in this case probably Jeremy Corbyn. So it's risky. The prime minister can stray as far as she wants from the legislature's priorities, up to the point where the legislators would be better off replacing her with someone from the opposite party. Okay, this was the slide where I was supposed to tell you that, I guess. One thing that's interesting about parliamentary systems is that you don't have split governments. You don't have the legislature being run by the Democrats and the executive being held by the Republicans, right? You either have a coalition form, which is what we saw in Great Britain in the early 2000s. Labour and the Lib Dems created a coalition in which Nick Clegg, the leader of the Lib Dem party, took on some number of important cabinet posts underneath the Labour Prime Minister, or you have an electoral redo. Parliament is hung and you have to have a new election, and the old administration stays on for a short time as a caretaker government until the election can be redone. Okay, so we might wonder then whether the difference between a presidential and parliamentary system has any effect on political outcomes. And there are a number of studies that demonstrate that there are welfare differences and social differences and interest aggregation differences that arise from having presidential versus parliamentary systems. But the one that I'd like to talk about very briefly is coups. In Survival of Presidential Democracies, Joseph Cheboub asked whether there was any difference between presidential and parliamentary democracy with respect to coups. He theorized about who might be attempted to overthrow a democratically elected government and when, right? He asks, under what circumstances would a person want to overthrow a democratically elected government? The legislature normally doesn't. The executive might, when the legislature disagrees with him. If the president or the prime minister disagrees with the executive and the executive has authority over the army, it might be possible to collaborate with the army and overthrow the government by sending the legislature home, right? The legislature home. The executive remains. Okay. Now, in a parliamentary system, the legislature rarely disagrees with the prime minister. They were elected from the same party. They have the same goals. Since split governments or coalition governments are impossible or unlikely, and when they are coalition governments, they typically have a center of gravity close to the prime minister, the prime minister is never tempted to shut down the legislature in the way that a presidential executive is. In addition to which, if the party that's just been ousted from power wants to continue to play by the rules, they need to impeach the president. And if the president, who has taken over through a self-coup, or an autogolpe as they call them in Latin America, where they were extremely common in the 1970s and 80s, what they need to do is get together a quorum of legislators and have a vote in which the president is removed by impeachment. And if there's a supermajority and the president has some support in the old legislature, that's unlikely to happen. So we might test this, right? Indeed, existing evidence. I won't bore you with all of the details, although it's a fantastic book if you're interested in these sorts of things. Cheboub compares the time that each type of regime lasts, and he notes that parliamentary regimes last a lot longer. They're much more stable than presidential systems. And presidential systems, when they fall, often fall to a coup, and particularly they are susceptible to self-coups. I think that the book has one example going all the way back to the 1800s of a parliamentary system that's overthrown by a self-coup enacted by the prime minister. I can't remember where that is, but I probably should have looked that up before I started this lecture. Okay, note too that we're controlling for some other theoretical explanations here. In the actual section in which Cheboub provides his evidence, he shows that it's not the wealth of countries in which they are observed, or their economic performance, or the conditions under which they emerge, right? So post-colonial countries are no different than countries that emerged of their own accord. It just happens that across all different types of countries, all different types of economic performance, all different wealth profiles, presidential systems are prone to coups. In fact, there is only one really important presidential outlier, one presidential system that has stood the test of time, and that is the United States. And the real tragedy, I think, of what Cheboub finds in his book is that the vast majority of places that designed presidential systems designed them after the American system because they're so stable, because our system has proven so stable in this way. But there's something institutionally or socially magic about the United States, or at least has been, that has allowed us to resist, or allowed our leaders to resist, this temptation to engage in a self-coup. Another example of variation in democratic practice and in the division of powers is the extent to which we give minorities local rights over social outcomes, and we call this federalism. When and where and how do we devolve powers to local groups of people who would rather not that those social outcomes be controlled by the federal state? So here's how federalism works. At a national level, the federal government is given control over certain types of operational rules, as well as usually the electoral, institutional, and constitutional rules of its own institutions. In the strongest federalist systems, that is those places where we give the most power to locals, the feds usually hang on to power over trade, currency, and foreign policy. There is an example of a federalist system in which the federal government attempted to devolve control over foreign policy, currency policy, and trade policy to its members. Does anyone know what country attempted to do this and how it worked out? If you guessed the United States, you are correct. The Articles of Confederation, for example, allowed each state, or afforded each state, the rights to print its own currency. And the Confederated States quickly fell apart, right? So I guess it wasn't the United States, the Confederated States. Quickly fell apart because there was no unity in how to manage foreign threats. There was no unity in how to manage the economy. The federal government was just a chimera that existed solely to attempt to raise an army that it couldn't afford to raise because it had no tax powers either. Okay, so after we have given these powers to the federal government, we provide some more local unit with control over certain types of social policy. Education, welfare are sort of standard places to devolve this type of power, right? And the purpose of this is to empower people that are majorities, demographics that are majorities within a state that would be minorities at the federal level, so that they get to make decisions about some of their operational rules. I am from Minnesota, and I can tell you that Minnesotans do not want to have anything to do with the way that coastal elites run their states. They like to have this happy middle ground where we have a relatively conservative government, but we spend lots of money on things like Minnesota Public Radio and our school system and our welfare system. And we like to be welcoming to people to their face and then talk badly about them behind their backs. And if you think that the federal government should take that power from us, then gosh darn you right to heck. So we appreciate having this bulwark that keeps the powerful federal interest from dictating to us how to run our quasi-socialist Norwegian Lufka state or Lefka state. We also want to protect from powerful majorities in other states, right? We don't want the Californians to be able to set policy in Maryland or Alaska or vice versa. So what sorts of problems might federalism solve? Like, what might you think federalism is more or less designed to do? Well, one thing that comes to mind is we might think that federalism helps manage ethnic tensions in states that are multinational, right? If we have more than one nation in a state, in a place like, for example, Spain, perhaps one thing that we could do to help the Basque or the Catalonians feel like they're more welcome in the state is to give them power over their own education. Let them speak their native language in schools. Let them manage certain aspects of their own social policy. So perhaps if we give minorities rights, they're less likely to rebel. Notice, though, that there is, as sensible as this theory sounds, there is a sensible mirror image of this theory. Perhaps by giving minorities more rights, by allowing them to elect their own elites, by giving them a taste of what it's like to not have to negotiate with the rest of the minority groups in your country, maybe they become more likely to rebel because they become more politically organized, they become stronger, and they become more demanding. Let's take a look. Phil Roeder, author of Sustainable Peace, Power and Democracy After Civil War, another one of those pesky UCSD professors I like to cite, worried that the straightforward and logical explanation, the theory about how federalism prevents civil wars, might be wrong. Perhaps, he mused, if we make political units about ethnicity, the politicians that run them will be rewarded by making everything else about ethnicity too. There are some reasons to think that he might be right. 6 of 9 ethnically divided societies failed to sustain peace and democracy despite having initiated federalist institutions. So Professor Roeder checks to see which types of institutions here are independent variable, which types of separation of powers lead to less likelihood of an ethno-nationalist crisis or an armed conflict. And what he finds is that only non-ethnic federalism leads to more peace in any sort of significant way. With the exception of territorial autonomy, which you can see up here, which he argues essentially turns into devolving the territory out of the government anyway. So there are some sorts of non-ethnic forms of federalism. For example, he advocates for PR systems, proportional representation systems, that are in districts that overlap between ethnicities, which forces those ethnicities to cooperate to create policy in districts that are multi-ethnic, but affords each of them legislative representatives in order to do so. So, independent variable sets of institutions, dependent variable ethnic conflict, there is a strong relationship between these things. Okay. This section makes the general argument that institutional and constitutional rules operate to change policy outcomes. I totally lost the train of thought on this slide. I had no idea where I was going. Let's skip ahead then to governance rules, the executive. Okay. Or cabinets, purpose and selection. Wow. Something. I changed the layout of these slides with sort of a global edit, and now they're all out of order. Okay. A handful of other things to tie up before we're done for the day. Just a few more slides. The chaos is about to be over. Cabinets, part of the executive, they're the highest level of executive bureaucracy. In the United States, we think about Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of Agriculture. cabinets do a lot of policy making in presidential systems in particular. Well, I guess they do a lot of policy making in parliamentary systems, since they're the ones who are writing the laws that go down to the legislature. So we might care, for example, about whether the cabinet type is majority or split, whether they're likely to cooperate on policy or be opposed on policy. It shouldn't be surprising that in any sort of two-party system, where we have first past the post elections, we get a two-party system. The election result is always going to be majoritarian, and so because we have a majoritarian election result, we have a single-party cabinet. Places like the United States, you oftentimes see presidents nominate one or two members to their cabinet who are moderates in the opposition's political party, so that they can look like they are being bipartisan. But the vast majority of people in Trump's cabinet are Republicans, and the vast majority of people in Obama's cabinet were Democrats. When you have a minority situation, when you have a coalition government, you end up sometimes with split or coalition cabinets. And this can wreak a lot of havoc on how integrated policy is, right? I think we're going to call it a day. The last few slides here seem to just be remnants from things that I wanted to discuss earlier in the lecture. So I apologize about that. Thank you for tuning into this video, assuming that you did tune in. I guess if you didn't tune in, you wouldn't be hearing me say that, so screw you. I will be back next Friday. We will meet in person when we will talk about the circumstances under which democratic regimes slide backward toward authoritarianism.